Perfect. Thanks very much indeed. So I want to talk about the challenges for your lungs of going to the moon. Now, a bit of context here. Why are we talking about going there? Well, we're actually thinking about going there. That's Mars. But if we're going to go to Mars, we've got to go there first. That's the moon, right? And the reason we want to go there first is because that's kind of Mars with the training wheels on, right? That's easy. It's close, like you can see Earth, right? It's only 400,000 kilometers away. Now, that's really close. Space is big, really big, as Douglas Adams said. And we're going to go there. People say, we've been there. What do we need to do that for? Well, yeah, we've been there. The longest lunar surface stay was Apollo 17, 3 days. It's a camping trip. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about going there and living there, because if we want to go to Mars, we have to learn to live not just in space, as in, say, the International Space Station, which is very close, but some distance away where the logistics get hard, the comms get hard, everything gets hard. And so the moon is sort of the first place. And if you're going to go climb Everest, you probably want to go up Mount Kosciuszko first or something, you know, probably not straight to Everest. And so you're going to go there for about 6 months, which is what the mission models will call for. And so what are the problems for the lung? Now, why am I talking about the lung? Why don't I talk about the heart? I don't know anything about the heart, so I'm not going to talk about that. But you can pick your favorite organ system, whatever it is, and it's probably not the lung, except for me, maybe Bruce. Pick your favorite organ system and just project the sort of problem. So your job is you've got to manage the risk of going there. So what are the risks of going to the moon for 6 months? Well, the first one is 6 months in lunar gravity, about 1/6 G. We've all evolved, we've all been born, we've all grown up in 1 G. So that's novel. We don't know what that's like. So that's one risk that you might think, oh, that's a problem. The next one's probably a little less obvious. It's decompression sickness. And you'll think, what the hell is he talking about? Don't divers have problems with decompression sickness? I'll explain that as we get there. And the third one is terribly prosaic. It's dust. Now, those, surprisingly, are the 3 big ticket items for the lung of going to the moon. So let's talk about the first one, which is low gravity. We don't know anything about spending time in 1/6 G because the longest period anybody has spent in 1/6 G is about 3 days, the longest Apollo mission on the lunar surface. But people have spent a long time on the International Space Station now, over a year for some folk, but typically plenty of 6-month stays. And so I'm going to put forward the hypothesis, if you will, that if you can tolerate 0 G for 6 months, you can probably tolerate 1/6 G for 6 months. So what happens to the lung in 0 G? And so people don't really know what lungs are like because you don't ever see lungs, at least most people don't. And if you do see one, it looks typically like a hunk of liver or something. And that's not what a lung is like at all. The lung is a very delicate organ. And this is a composite micrograph of 2 pieces of mammalian lung. One from the top of the lung, somewhere up here, one from the bottom of the lung, somewhere down here. And hopefully you can see a difference. The bit at the top, which is from the top of the lung, has big spaces in it. Those are called alveoli. That's the air space. And not very much red stuff. The red stuff is blood. Okay, why? Because blood's heavy. So the blood's all down the bottom of the lung. And the bottom of the lung has smaller air spaces. Why? Because it's compressed. And if you don't understand why that is, think about a slinky spring. And if you hold a slinky spring up like that, coils at the top are far apart, coils at the bottom are close together because of the effect of gravity on the lung. So ask yourself the question now, in my head, turn off gravity. What happens to that? And you'd expect it to change. And in fact, you'd expect the blood to be uniform. You'd expect the holes in it, the alveoli spaces, to be about the same. We measured that. This is a photograph taken in June of 1991. This is a chap called Jim Bajan. He's an anesthesiologist, anaesthetist here, performing spirometry on Spacelab Life Sciences 1. So it's a space shuttle flight. It was 9 days long. We did experiments on that. We did experiments on a number of other shuttle flights. And what we showed is that indeed the redistribution of blood and ventilation, gas and blood, changed as you would have probably guessed from that. And there were a number of things went on. I'm not going to go through them, which doesn't tell us very much about going to the moon for 6 months, because the longest shuttle flight we had was LMS in 1996, and it was 17 days. So the question comes up, what happens to the lung in the prolonged absence of gravity? So we got to finally fly in 2001 to 2003 on the International Space Station. This is the space station when we went there. It doesn't look anything like that now, much, much bigger. But this was the very earliest days of space stations. And this is Don Pettit, an astronaut, holding much the same equipment that Jim Bajan was holding, except he's on the space station. And we had 4 crews and exposures between 130 and 196 days. We had 10 people, which we managed to study over those 4 increments. Which is a staggeringly large number, by the way, for a flight experiment. You're lucky if you get 4 often, so small n science. We did a number of measurements. I'm not going to go through them because basically this topic here tells you the entire thing you need to know. 6 months, lung function is unchanged in the 1G environment after you've been up there for 6 months. In other words, and this doesn't apply, by the way, to other organ systems like the heart, or the bones, or the musculature, the skeletal muscle. But the lungs, you can take up the lungs to an environment it's never seen before, leave it there for 6 months, come home, and a week later it's like never leave. So the lung is either really well designed or really stupid. I'm not sure which it is. But what you can say,
I'm just going to quickly
yeah, sure.
the screen. I noticed that our online participants unfortunately don't see.
So you can say, sorry, I'll keep talking, you don't need to see anything. What you can say is if you can tolerate 6 months in microgravity, you can probably tolerate 6 months on lunar gravity. So it's probably not a problem. Tick that one off the list, stop worrying about it. If you're a risk manager, anybody saying to you, stop worrying about it is music to your ears. All right, it's a pretty picture. It's Wellington Harbour up there. I was born there. That's why I put it up. You know. Decompression sickness. Why am I talking about decompression sickness? Well, decompression sickness results when tissues that are saturated with nitrogen and then experience a big reduction in pressure, which is what would happen if you ascend from a deep dive and scuba diving, for example. But it also occurs if you reduce pressure from where you are now. So if I suddenly could reduce the pressure in this room sufficiently, I could get everybody a dose of DCS. And what happens is that venous gas bubbles form and they actually lodge in the lung and they disrupt blood flow through the lung, and we can measure that. And EVA, extravehicular activity, comes with it a very large reduction in pressure. Why? Because if you pressurized a spacesuit to 1 atmosphere pressure, you'd be like this. And that's all you'd do all day. And you wouldn't do anything else. You couldn't even close your hands, right? So you have to run spacesuits at a very low pressure. The engineering challenges of a high-pressure spacesuit are very challenging. And the US suits run at only 220 millimeters of mercury. It's about 1/3 of the atmosphere. It's about the pressure at the top of Everest, by the way. So if you went from this room environment, 1 atmosphere, to 1/3 of an atmosphere, you'd be a guaranteed bend, and it would probably be a fatal bend. So you can't do that. So you go through a staging process, just as divers do coming up from a deep dive where they stage their way up. Same process occurs. We asked the question, again on space station. Now there's been no reports of decompression sickness in flight, by the way. Nobody's ever reported it. So either the process is really good or they're not reporting it. Who knows? But we did an experiment. We looked at people the day after they'd done an EVA on station. We looked at them before that on station, we looked at them after. And what we found is that there was no change in gas exchange. So in other words, they did a really good job at getting rid of nitrogen bubbles, or preventing nitrogen bubbles occurring, pardon me. And the current denitrogenation protocols don't result in any lasting problem in gas exchange. And so you say, great, we're doing a good job. So again, you can sort of tick off a risk, except to say there's a problem. And the problem sort of comes up with, this is a cartoon from Artemis, what they're planning to do, the 6 months on the surface. What are you doing for 6 months on the surface? You're doing an EVA, surface EVA 5 days a week, typically. That's the sort of mission model that's being run. The denitrogenation protocol I talked about takes 4 hours. That says, I think I'll pop outside. It's 4 hours before I get to open the door. Now, that's a huge mission overhead, right? So you can't live with that. That's going to screw up your work week pretty seriously. So what they've done is, and we worked on this, we're building a base. What's the atmosphere? Does it have to be this? The answer, no. And in fact, if you put the right atmosphere in there, which is about half the pressure we're at now, about 32% oxygen, so you're not at too high a equivalent altitude, your decompression time, your pre-breathe time drops from 4 hours to about 15 minutes. So that's getting to an acceptable level. So you can engineer your way out of that problem. So you can sort of tick decompression sickness off the list. All right, so you can now do your EVAs. Christchurch is down there. I went to university there. Yeah. So, dust. This is the other problem. And this one sounds terribly prosaic, but in fact, it's quite a challenge, I think. And it is, in my opinion, at least, the residual challenge that we're going to face for lunar exploration in terms of the lung. Picture of Neil Armstrong's boot print on the lunar surface, taken in 1969. You can learn a hell of a lot about the lunar surface in that one photograph. If you look at that photograph, the detail of his boot print is quite exquisite. So that tells you a couple of things. It tells you, one, that the particles involved in that surface are very fine. If you put that boot on the sand at the beach, it wouldn't look like that, right? So it's very, very fine grained, and they're all stuck together. I mean, look at the ridge lines on that boot. They're very sharp. So it's cohesive, so it sticks to things. And they found that in Apollo. This is a lunar Apollo traverse, and you can see a sort of a blue haze around him. He's sort of like this guy. The dust sticks to the suit. Look at that suit, it's filthy. And you say, but that's all right, they're in a space suit. They're all sealed up. Yep, they are. You don't live in a space suit forever. And they tried to get rid of it, and they took a brush up, and at least on the later missions, not on the first mission. That didn't work at all well. It was largely useless. This is Gene Cernan, the last man on the moon, taken in 1972. The photograph is taken by Jack Schmidt, and taken inside the lunar module, and he's filthy. So he's taken his suit off, and he's covered in dust. And Jack Schmidt, when I spoke to him about this, said, when you took your helmet off, it smelled like somebody had fired a gun in the cabin. This acrid smell. So what do we know? That the dust was a universal component of every single lunar surface Apollo debrief. They all complained about it. And you can read those, boy, you're a dirty day. I think we're just going to have to live with it. That was Gene Cernan on Apollo 17. So what do we know about the lunar regolith? Regolith is a fancy word for dirt, by the way. It's got a significant respirable dust fraction. By that I mean less than about 10 microns in size, fine grained. It's generated primarily by impacts. The reason the moon is dusty is because of micrometeorites pulverizing the surface. Not on Earth, that's, by the way, not the case here. The dust here is generated primarily by waterborne events, rocks tumbling down hills and rivers and things like that. And then drying out. Some volcanism. You get some shock melting. You get these exquisitely beautiful dust grains. These are quite large at 100 micron, but they have a huge surface area associated with them. So if you thought about a sphere, its surface to volume ratio is fixed. 4/3 pi r cubed over 4 pi r squared over 4/3 pi r cubed. That has a very high surface to volume ratio. And in terms of toxicology, that's a problem. If you don't think particulate matter matters, take a look at history. 1952, December, London, the Great Fog of London, was a 6-day pollution event where smog was trapped in an inversion layer, very high particulate matter levels. It is estimated, and the estimates vary, but one of the lower estimates is that the Great Fog of London was responsible for 4,000 excess deaths. They bumped off 4,000 people in 6 days. That's particulate matter. So don't say it doesn't matter. Terrestrial dust are known to be a problem. I went down to Home Depot, that's Bunnings, okay, in California. Bought a bag of sand. Okay, bag of sand. That's the warning on the bag of sand. If you read that, you think you're going to die. So is it safe to go to the beach? Well, it is. It's perfectly fine. The reason it's safe to go to the beach is what they're talking about there is crystalline silica, which when it's fresh fractured, has unfulfilled bonds on the surface and is highly reactive. And it's a known toxicant. It's actually typically used as the positive control in inhalation toxicology experiments. So that's your nasty end of the world. But it weathers, right? So why? Because we've got oxygen in the air, we've got water vapor in the air, and those bonds ultimately get activated, deactivated. But we have to worry about it. Now on the moon, there's no atmosphere. The moon doesn't have an atmosphere, it has an exosphere technically, very low. So you can fresh fracture a particle on the lunar surface, and 5 million years later, it's still fresh, okay? That's not the case here on Earth. So it matters. Toxicology, I don't know much about, so you go to the textbooks, inhalation toxicology for dummies. Always a good, the full series, the For Dummies series, I found to be very helpful in my life. 3 questions. How much deposits? How long does it stay around? And how nasty is the stuff that deposits? There's inhalation toxin in a nutshell. And why do we care about the moon? Well, turns out, without getting into the nasty details, one of the processes by which particles impact or particles deposit is sedimentation. They impact, big particles impact, they can't go around the corner, right? As you breathe in, you've got to go around the corner, they run off to the side, like a race car running off the outside of a racetrack. Come into the corner too fast. Little ones, itty bitty ones, move around by diffusion because air molecules bumping into them are a big part of their day. But the middle-sized ones sediment out. And that's a gravitational process, right? So now we come back to the moon and you say, ooh, that's different. Gravity is different, sedimentation is different. We didn't study it in spaceflight, we studied it in parabolic flight. Dwayne was talking about parabolic flight, he's going flying next month. Great fun. If you don't know how parabolic flight works, fly the plane like that. 25 seconds later, it's like that. 45 seconds later, it's like that. You get the idea. It's a dynamic environment, shall we say. So if you're blonde with a ponytail, it looks much better. In 0G, this is doing aerosol deposition studies in the plane. And this is looking at aerosol deposition in lunar gravity. We actually did experiments in 16G, so you can fly the plane to 16G rather than 0G if you like. And 2 things come out. What we did was we inhaled boluses of particles, little lumps of particles into a breath, and we could put those early into the breath, so we went deep into the lung. We put them in late, where they came out, stay in the central airways, right? Early, late. The green line's in 1G, what you're getting now. The blue line is lower, it's in 16G. So fewer particles deposit, you go thumbs up. Not so fast. The trouble is where they deposit is more peripheral, and that matters. You're all exposed to dust. I came in on the train this morning, right? Trains generate dust, diesel particles crossing the road, right? Why aren't you full of dust? You've been breathing it all your life. And the answer is we have clearance mechanisms, right? We get rid of it. And in fact, the lady, and I've forgotten your name, and I apologize for that, from University of New South Wales, there she is, showed little wonderful videos of cilia beating on her organelles. And your airways are lined with cilia, and it moved, particles deposit, and they're moved upwards, northward, and you swallow them and you get rid of them. Okay, we won't talk about that process. But that's how you get, that's why you don't fill up with dust over the course of your lifetime. But where they deposit matters, and you measure mucociliary clearance by putting radioactive labeled particles into somebody, and then measure how much they move. And what happens is over the course of time, you can see those are images taken 5 minutes apart, and hopefully you can appreciate that there's a bolus moving up the central airway, and it's going northward. So particles that were deposited in here get moved upwards to my glottis, and then I can swallow them. In this case, Dewing can swallow them. And if you deposit those particles right out in the periphery of the lung, they stay there for a hell of a long time. So if you've inhaled something nasty, you want to get rid of it quick. Make sense? If you inhale something deeply into the lung, you don't get rid of it quick. So it's got time to be nasty and do things longer. We did look at deposition in microgravity. This is a photograph of colleagues of mine performing the same experiment, but basically this is in zero G. You can tell by Chantal's hair sticking out to the side there. And deposition changes, I'm not going to go into the details, but changes the difference. Hopefully you can appreciate that the picture on the left and the picture on the right look different, okay? Keep it at that level. I work with an ESA topical team on the toxicity of lunar dust, published a bit of a paper which gives us an overview. It talks about the fact that the particles are reactive, they damage the cells, and reactive oxygen species are generated. Again, I'm not going to go into the details. NASA have known this for a long time, and Chewing Lam and John James did a very good series of exposure measurements in rats, where they tried to establish what's called a permissible exposure limit, a PEL. And this is an example where on the left, on the right is titanium dioxide. That's kind of your negative control. Titanium dioxide is used in lots of things. Most of the women in this room have titanium dioxide on their face right now because it's used in makeup. For example, it's used in white paint. It's sort of a nuisance dust. The other extreme is quartz down here on the bottom left. That's your positive control. And lunar dust sort of sits somewhere in the middle. So they've got a permissible exposure level. The problem with those PELs at the moment, and the open question, is surface reactivity. Lunar dust has an interesting component called nanophase iron. This is iron, and we're all exposed to iron. We have iron in our blood, but that's in the Fe2+ state, ferrous iron, and we're exposed to ferric oxide, Fe3+, rust. Right, you've all seen it, the typical color. There's Fe0. That's a thing that you aren't exposed to routinely. We don't know about it. It's encapsulated in the glassy matrix of the shock melted components. You can see them there circled. And it has very high surface reactivity. This is a chemical exposure. The dotted lines at the bottom are a normal lunar dust simulant. The black line, the big high peak, is a simulant with nanophase iron in it. You can see it's a great deal more chemical reactivity. Does that translate to toxicology, to toxicological damage? We don't know. But the important thing is that Billy Wallace did these experiments in Alabama. The time scale to get rid of that excess reactivity is quite slow. It's the half-life, and I don't mean radioactive half-life, but the chemical half-life there is about 4 hours. If it was 5 milliseconds, you wouldn't care about it, right? Because you're coming in your suit, you go in, you've got to doff your suit. If by the time you've pressurized the airlock and take your suit off, it's already passivated. But if it takes 4 hours to passivate, not true. So there's a real challenge there. So that's the story about lunar dust. It's probably more of a problem than Martian dust. Why do I say that? Well, Mars does have an atmosphere, and they have a hell of a lot of an atmosphere, 600 pascals, 0.006 of an atmosphere, mostly CO2, but there's a lot of suspended dust, and you can see it in that photograph. It's a photograph on Mars. Look at the red haze. It's local. You can have dust storms. There's a dust devil on Mars. It can be global. These are two photographs taken by Hubble of Mars about, let me see, 3 months apart. And you can see on the right the consequence of a global scale dust storm, where apart from the poles, the whole place is blanketed. People with rovers found out about the challenge of that. This is Spirit, and now defunct rover. The reason it's defunct is that solar panels are covered in dust. So it turns out that probably Martian dust is less of a problem because there is an atmosphere which will passivate that dust. Just as dust here is a problem, but it's not a huge problem, it doesn't kill us that quickly. But particles here on Earth do affect us. And I'm going to stop at that point because Bruce is going to tell you about why we care about this as a sort of an occupational health problem. And it's a serious problem. And there are problems here in Australia with it. There's been problems before. But nevertheless, it turns out that dust on the lunar surface is probably going to be the big challenge for the lung. The rest of the time, the lung's pretty happy, but not with dust. We were lucky to be supported by NIH, NASA, and the National Space Biomedical Institute. Crews did a lot of our experiments. We can't thank them enough. I didn't do this. A team of us did that. They're not all acknowledged here, but it's not me, it's us. And I'm appreciative of them, by the way. Thank you for your time.